I am a cartographer. That is the first thing you need to understand about me, and about everything I am going to tell you. I am not a soldier. I am not a diplomat. I am not one of the veterans who sit in the rest houses near the old border markers, drinking something fermented and dark, watching the void with eyes that have stopped processing most of what they see. I have never fired a weapon in anger, never given an order that sent a crew into danger, never stood on a command deck with my heart's hammering while something enormous and incomprehensible moved toward me out of the dark. I draw lines. That is the entirety of my profession, reduced to its plainest statement. I am the fourth surveyor of the outer registers, a title that sounds grander than it is, because what it means, stripped of ceremony, is that I am the one responsible for the accuracy of the star charts from the Telveth Shoals outward to the Kerum Gradient, a region of space that contains 11 inhabited systems, 47 catalogued hazards, one navigational anomaly that has never been satisfactorily explained, and one very large blank space where, if we were drawing the chart honestly, there would be a great deal to mark. We do not draw it honestly, we leave it blank. That decision was mine. I have been asked over the years to explain this. Other surveyors, younger ones mostly, who came up after the Igerin excursion and know the blank sector only as a given fact of the charts, as natural and unexamined as the shape of a nebula, occasionally ask me what lies in the blank space, whether there is something there that simply has not been charted yet, whether the blankness is an error, an oversight, a gap waiting to be filled. I tell them it is filled, the blank is the mark, and then usually they stop asking. I will try here to explain what I mean by that. I will try to explain how a cartographer arrives at the decision that the most honest thing he can do with a given region of space is to say nothing about it. I will try to explain the Igerin excursion, not what happened during it, because I was not there and no one who was there is in a position to tell you now, but what it meant for the charts, what it meant for the work, what it meant for me, specifically, sitting at the drafting table in the hall of the outer registers on Veth San, with the raw relay data in front of me and a stylus in my hand, and no symbol in any index I had ever consulted that was adequate to what the data was describing. I have never spoken of this at length before. I am speaking of it now because I am old, and because the hall has taken on an apprentice who is, frankly, better at this work than I have ever been, and because I think it is time someone wrote down what the blank space means before the last person who was present for the decision is no longer present to be asked. Let me begin with what the charts are. The outer registers are not simply navigational tools. That is how most species think of star charts, as practical documents, maps for the getting from one place to another, useful in the same way that a tide table is useful, consulted, and set aside. But the registers are older than that conception of them. The Veth have been maintaining the outer registers for longer than most of the current council species have held spaceflight, and in that time, the charts have accumulated a kind of authority that goes beyond navigation. The registers are the memory of the outer reaches. They record not only where things are but what happened there. A system with a red hazard designation carries in its margin a brief notation of the event that earned the designation, the name of the ship that was lost, the date of the encounter, the nature of the threat. A transit lane marked with a caution band carries a record of why the caution was placed, by whom, under what authority. The charts are full of this marginal notation. If you sit with the registers long enough and read the margins carefully enough, you get, over time, something close to a history of the outer reaches. Not a proud or triumphant history, for the most part, but an honest one. Every cartographer who has ever worked the outer registers has been trained to apply this same principle to whatever they encounter. Something happened. Record it. Something is dangerous. Name the danger. Something is unknown. Mark it unknown and give the boundaries of the unknown region. The chart's job is not to make the outer reaches look safe or manageable or understood. The chart's job is to tell the truth. I was trained in this tradition by my predecessor, a surveyor named Veth, who had worked the registers for 60 years and who had, in that time, catalogued more hazards than anyone in the Hall's long history. Veth was not an easy teacher. He had no patience for imprecision and very little tolerance for what he called cartographer's comfort. The tendency to soften a notation because the honest version was alarming, to use approximate language because the specific truth was difficult to look at, to leave a dangerous region with a provisional note instead of sitting with the evidence long enough to give the danger its proper name. He used to say, "You are not paid to make people feel better about the outer reaches. You are paid to tell them what is there. If what is there is frightening, write the frightening thing. If what is there is unknown, write the unknown thing." The only form of dishonesty available to a cartographer is the softened notation, the approximate boundary, the hazard given a gentler name than it deserves. All three of these are failures of professional responsibility, and if you indulge them, you will eventually send someone into something they were not prepared for, and that will be your fault, and you will have to live with it. I believed this completely when I was an apprentice. I believe it now. Veth had a phrase he used when apprentices were inclined to leave something vague or approximate rather than deal with the difficulty of recording it precisely. The chart is not for you. He meant that the chart was not for the comfort of the person drawing it. The chart was for the person who would consult it in the dark, far from any station, with a decision to make. That person deserved the truth. If the truth was uncomfortable to write down, that was the cartographer's problem, not a reason to soften what the chart said. I spent 4 years under Veth before he retired from active survey work, and I was assigned to the outer registers in my own capacity. In those 4 years, he took me through every corner of the hazard index and explained, case by case, why each notation had been developed and what it was designed to convey. There were notations in the index for things I had never encountered in the course of ordinary navigation, extreme radiation events, spatial anomalies of the kind that produced navigational dead zones, corridor collapse events, and a handful of others that were in the index primarily as historical records, because the phenomena they described had not been observed in living memory. One of those notations was the one applied at that time to the uncharted corridor. The corridor had been in the registers under various designations for as long as the outer reaches charts had existed. In my apprentice years, it was listed as a provisional navigation exclusion zone with a historical hazard annotation, the kind of entry that, in practice, accumulated in the registers when a region had a long history of ships not returning from it, but without specific enough documentation to assign a precise hazard type. The annotation noted the history of the corridor briefly. The boundary was marked with a dotted survey line, indicating that the boundary itself was provisional. The extent of the exclusion zone had been estimated rather than precisely surveyed, which was a reflection of the fact that no survey team had operated in the region for generations. Veth, when he explained the corridor entry to me, did not editorialize. He gave me the historical record, the first recorded losses in the region, the dates, the gradual formalization of the exclusion zone, the council's involvement in establishing the advisory. He gave me the current state of the documentation, sparse, old, consistent only in the pattern of non-return. He told me that the corridor was one of the register's longest-standing unresolved entries, which in practical terms meant an entry whose hazard type had never been precisely identified, whose boundaries had never been formally surveyed, and whose notation had been accumulating historical addenda for several centuries without ever being upgraded from provisional. Then he said something I did not understand at the time. He said, "Some entries in the registers resist resolution because the region genuinely has not been surveyed with adequate instruments, or because the hazard type is rare enough that the sample size of documented encounters is too small to make a reliable determination. Those entries should be pursued: more survey data, better instruments, closer examination. The corridor is not that kind of entry. The corridor resists resolution because what is in the corridor does not reduce to the kind of data that produces resolvable entries. I have thought about that for a long time, and I believe it to be true. And I want you to hold that thought somewhere you can find it again if you need it. I filed that thought and went on with my apprenticeship. And in time, I took over the outer registers and spent my working years cataloging the hazards of the Telveth shoals to the Karum gradient. And the corridor sat in the registers as it had always sat, with its provisional notation and its dotted boundary line and its long history of non-returns. And for many years, it was simply another open entry in a catalog that contained many open entries. And I dealt with it the way you deal with a long-standing, unresolved problem, by leaving it where it was and working around it, and occasionally pulling it out to examine it, and putting it back when examination yielded nothing new. And then the Igeran sent their fleet. The Igeran were, I use the past tense not carelessly, but because it is now accurate, a militarized civilization from the Mivrath cluster, about 40 light-years from the edge of what the charts marked at that time as the uncharted corridor. They were not members of the Karum Council. They had been invited to join the council 3 times in the past century and had declined each time, for reasons that were internally consistent with their culture and that I will not judge here. They had a fleet. A substantial one, built over several generations for purposes of both defense and projection, and they were good at using it. The Igeran had won every military engagement they had ever entered, and they were aware of this fact, and they drew from it certain conclusions about their place in the hierarchy of capable civilizations. One of those conclusions was that the warnings about the uncharted corridor were excessive. Now, and I want to be precise about this, because imprecision here would be a disservice to both the Igeran and to history. The warnings they were given were not specific. They could not be specific, because specificity requires knowledge, and the knowledge in this case was extremely limited. What the council told the Igeran was what the council had been telling everyone who approached that region of space for the better part of 3 centuries. The corridor is marked uncharted. No survey teams operate there. Ships that enter the corridor do not return. The reasons for this are not completely understood, but the pattern is consistent enough that the council strongly advises against approach. The Igeran, who had heard variations of this warning applied to regions that turned out to contain nothing more dangerous than unusual radiation profiles and difficult navigation, concluded that the council was being overcautious. They had a historian on their advisory council who had researched the outer register's earlier entries on the corridor and had produced a report. I read this report later, after the excursion, as part of my documentation work, arguing that the historical losses attributed to the corridor were likely explained by a combination of factors: the navigational difficulty of the region, the limitations of older drive technology, and the possibility that some of the early losses had been incorrectly attributed to the corridor when their actual causes lay elsewhere. The report was careful and well-researched and arrived at a wrong conclusion, and the wrongness was not a failure of scholarship, but of category. The historian had asked the right question about whether the available evidence justified the warning's severity, and had correctly answered that the available evidence, as historical evidence, did not fully justify the severity. What the historian had not been able to factor in was the relay data, which did not yet exist, and which, once it did exist, would render historical analysis irrelevant. This is an understandable error. It was also, as it turned out, catastrophically consequential. But here is the thing I want to say about the Igeran, and I want to say it plainly, without euphemism or the kind of careful diplomatic framing that official records tend to use. They were not reckless. The commanders of the Igeran excursion fleet were not young and careless, and seeking glory at the expense of their crew's lives. They were experienced officers who had run careful risk assessments and consulted with their most capable strategists and concluded, in good faith, based on the information available to them, that the warnings were likely overstated. They brought 14 warships. They brought survey equipment and scientific personnel. They had a plan for extraction if conditions proved hostile. They had contingencies for a range of scenarios they had identified as plausible. They had done, in short, what competent and responsible commanders do when they decide to attempt something difficult. They had prepared. I'm not saying this to redeem them, because there is nothing in what happened to them that requires redemption. They were people. They made a decision. The decision was wrong in a way that no amount of experience or careful preparation could have helped them anticipate, because what was wrong about it was not a tactical error. It was a categorical one. They thought they were entering a region of space that was dangerous in recognizable ways. They were not. The Igerin excursion departed the Veth cluster on the 4th day of the 2nd month, by the Veth calendar. 14 ships, approximately 900 crew. They crossed the outer marker of the uncharted corridor on the 8th day. I know this from their own transit logs, which the relay stations near the corridor's edge recorded as a matter of routine. The fleet's approach was not furtive. They were not hiding their presence. They crossed the outer marker at standard transit velocity and proceeded into the corridor's interior without slowing. On the 9th day, at the 3rd hour of the Veth night cycle, the relay stations at the corridor's edge recorded a light. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the relay data is specific, and I do not want to paraphrase it in a way that makes it sound smaller than it was. The relay stations at the corridor's edge are calibrated to detect a very wide range of electromagnetic events, from the ordinary background radiation of deep space to the high-energy emissions associated with weapons fire, reactor events, and stellar activity. They had, over 3 centuries of operation, logged tens of thousands of events of every kind and magnitude. The surveyors who designed and maintained them had built-in calibration ranges that accounted for the most energetic natural phenomena in the region, supernova events at moderate distances, high-intensity stellar flares, the electromagnetic pulses associated with large-scale spatial anomalies. The instruments were not delicate. They were built to withstand and measure extremes. The light that the relay stations recorded on the 9th day, 3rd hour, was outside the calibration range of the sensors on 2 of the 4 stations at the nearest edge. Not slightly outside the range, outside it in the way that a sound is outside the range of a hearing instrument when the instrument has been built to record sounds up to a certain loudness, and what it encounters is something many orders of magnitude louder than anything it was designed to measure. The sensors on those 2 stations clipped. They recorded their maximum value and held it for 47 seconds, and when the event ended and the readings dropped back into normal range, the stations ran a self-diagnostic because their calibration algorithms assumed, when a reading like that came in, that something had gone wrong with the instruments. Nothing had gone wrong with the instruments. The other 2 stations, positioned at a slightly greater distance and with slightly higher calibration thresholds, did not clip. They recorded the event in full. I have read their logs many times. I will not transcribe them here, partly for reasons I will come to, and partly because the raw numbers, stripped of context, give a misleading impression of what the event was. Numbers can be understood. Numbers exist on a scale that the mind can navigate, even when the numbers are very large. What the relay stations recorded on the 9th day was not, in the way that word is usually meant, understandable. It was not that the numbers exceeded familiar benchmarks. It was that the numbers bore no relationship to the category of events that the instruments had been built to detect. The instruments had been built to detect natural and artificial energetic events. The event of the 9th day was neither. I want to be careful here, because I am aware that this is the part of the account that sounds, to anyone who has not read the raw logs, like the kind of thing that gets said by people who are trying to make an ordinary event sound extraordinary. I understand that instinct. I share it in general. The relay stations in the outer reaches are old instruments operated by overworked survey teams, and their data is full of anomalies that turn out, on examination, to be instrument artifacts or miscalibrations or atmospheric interference from the local stellar environment. I have reviewed and corrected hundreds of such anomalies in my career. I reviewed the ninth-day data with that expectation. I ran the standard artifact check protocols on the clipped station's records. I checked the calibration logs for both of the non-clipping stations for the 48 hours before and after the event. I cross-referenced the timing against known solar activity in the region, against the background radiation profile, against the navigational data from the relay chain that extended outward from the corridor's edge toward the Veth approaches. I looked for every ordinary explanation, because ordinary explanations are almost always correct, and because I did not want to be the surveyor who submitted a report to the council based on a misread sensor log. There was no ordinary explanation. What I can tell you, because this is a fact of the simplest possible kind, a fact about presence and absence, is that the Igeran fleet did not come back. No ship returned. No distress beacon was ever received. No debris field was ever detected inside the corridor. No remains, no wreckage. No emergency relay burst of the kind that ships are designed to broadcast automatically when their drives fail or their hulls are breached. Nothing. 14 ships and 900 crew, and after the 9th day, 3rd hour, there was no further signal from any of them. The council sent 2 observer probes to the edge of the corridor 3 weeks after the event. Not inside, no one proposed sending anything inside, just to the edge to look. The probes came back intact. They had recorded nothing unusual in the corridor's immediate approach zone. No debris. No residual energy signature of the kind that lingers after a weapons engagement or a catastrophic drive failure. The corridor looked exactly as it always had from the outside. Dark, quiet, and empty. The Igeran expedition was over. The Karum Council issued a formal notification to the Veth cluster, which received it in silence. There was no response. I do not know, and have never known, what the Igeran's surviving population made of what happened to their fleet. I know that they did not send another expedition. I know that within a generation, the Veth cluster had withdrawn completely from the approach lanes nearest the corridor, and that the civilization designated in the old charts as Igeran had contracted, not collapsed, not gone, but quieter and smaller, as though something in them had understood that the correct response to what had happened was to take up less space in the outer reaches. They are still there. They have not returned to space in any meaningful way. I have a great deal of sympathy for them. I find it impossible to hold them in judgment, but I understand why the corridor silenced them. Because I sat with the relay data, and the relay data changed something in the way I thought about the outer reaches, and I was sitting in the hall of the outer registers on Veth at an extremely safe distance, drinking tea. Now I need to tell you about the symbol problem, because this is where the account becomes specifically about the work of cartography rather than the history of the Igeran, and the symbol problem is the heart of what I have to say. When I sat down at the drafting table 3 months after the Igeran excursion, after the council had finished its formal assessment and passed the data to the registers with a directive to update the charts accordingly, I came to the table prepared to do the work I had always done. Something happened. Record it. Something is dangerous. Name the danger. The outer registers use a codified system of margin symbols. This system has been developed and refined over the centuries of the hall's operation, and it is comprehensive in a way that reflects centuries of encounter with the full range of dangers the outer reaches present. It has symbols for stellar hazards of every known type, unstable stars in every classification of instability, radiation fields of every known composition and intensity range, gravitational anomalies from the mild to the catastrophic, dense debris zones from natural and artificial origins. It has symbols for biological hazards, worlds with hostile indigenous life at every threat level, atmospheric compositions dangerous to standard pressure species, zones with known pathogenic risks, regions where the interaction between local life and standard equipment had produced documented damage. It has symbols for navigational hazards of every variety that skilled navigators had so far managed to encounter and survive long enough to report. It has symbols for hostile civilizations. Multiple grades of them, in fact. A symbol for civilizations that are actively aggressive toward all incoming vessels without distinction. A symbol for civilizations that are aggressive toward specific known adversaries, but not toward general approach. A symbol for civilizations that have demonstrated aggressive capability, but have not yet engaged the broader galactic community in a way that produces consistent data. And a symbol for regions where the nature of the hostility is unknown, but the pattern of non-return is established enough to warrant designation. There is even a symbol, rarely used, present in the index as a historical accommodation rather than a common notation, for regions where the local intelligence has demonstrated capabilities that fall outside current council understanding. I went through the index, category by category, notation by notation, and I could not find a symbol that said what the relay data was saying. This took me the better part of 2 working days. I am not a slow reader, and the index is not structured to make systematic review difficult. It is organized precisely to allow a surveyor to move through it efficiently when looking for the right designation for an unusual hazard profile. I reviewed every relevant section. I reviewed sections that were not, on the surface, relevant, because I was aware that the relay data described something that did not fit neatly into any surface category, and I did not want to miss an adjacent designation that might serve. At the end of 2 days, I had a complete picture of what the index contained, and what it contained was not adequate. The problem was not that the index lacked scope. For its purpose, describing the hazards of the outer reaches as those hazards had been encountered and documented by the civilizations that had contributed to the registers, the index was genuinely comprehensive. It had been built by people who understood danger in all the forms they had encountered, and they had encountered a great deal. The problem was that the relay data described something that had not been encountered, in any meaningful sense, by the civilizations that built the index. Encountered in the sense of survived and returned and produced documentation that a cartographer could work with. The corridor had been encountered by many ships over 3 centuries, but the encounters produced no useful data about what was in the corridor, because the ships did not come back, and the only instrument that had recorded anything at all was the relay stations at the edge, and what they recorded was the 47 seconds. I tried at first to use the closest available symbols in combination. The index permits compound symbols for complex hazard profiles, a stellar hazard notation combined with a biological risk notation, for example, for a world with both an unstable sun and a hostile biosphere. This is standard practice for regions with multiple, distinct hazard types. I assembled a compound. The hostile advanced civilization symbol, combined with the unknown capability modifier, combined with the historical non-return annotation that had been in the corridor's entry for 3 centuries, combined with a general navigational hazard notation as a catch-all for the transit conditions. I drew the compound notation out on the draft chart, in the margin alongside the corridor's designated boundary. I looked at it for a long time. The problem with the compound notation was not that it was inaccurate. It was accurate, in the way that a description of an active star as a very large mass of very hot ionized material that emits vast quantities of energy is accurate, technically correct, conveying the relevant facts, and missing the point entirely. Anyone who looked at the notation I had assembled would understand that the region was dangerous. They would understand that there was a significant civilization present, that its capabilities were poorly understood, that ships had not returned from this region across a documented span of centuries. They would assign an appropriate level of caution and probably avoid the corridor. But they would not understand the relay data. And if they made their decision about the corridor based on the notation without understanding the relay data, they would be making the same category error the Igerin made, treating the corridor as a place where dangerous but comprehensible things might happen, where caution and preparation and the right equipment and the right number of ships might change the outcome. The compound notation said, "Here is a powerful adversary of uncertain capability." That is the kind of statement that invites a commander to think. With sufficient preparation, sufficient ships, a sufficiently well-planned approach, the outcome might be different. The Igerin had thought exactly that. I erased the compound notation from the draft. I sat there for another full working session, 6 hours, perhaps more. I was not counting, with the blank draft in front of me, and the relay data open on the secondary table and the stylus in my hand, trying to think of another approach to the problem. The hall was quiet around me. The other surveyors had finished their shifts. Outside the hall's observation ports, the void around Veth showed the ordinary scatter of stars that I had looked at for 40 years without finding them particularly remarkable. What I kept coming back to was Thale's principle. The chart is not for you. The chart is for the person who will consult it in the dark, far from any station, with a decision to make. That person deserves the truth. What was the truth? The truth was, if you enter this region, you will not come back. That is a fact established by consistent observation across 3 centuries and counting the Igerin, at least 17 separate documented cases involving ships from multiple different civilizations. The pattern had never broken. Not once. Not a single ship across all those documented cases had entered the corridor and returned. The Igerin are not an isolated datum. They are the most recent and the most thoroughly documented case, but they are not the only one, and the consistency of the pattern across such a long span of time and such diverse origins represents a kind of statistical certainty that I have never encountered in any other entry in the registers. That was one part of the truth. The chart's existing notation, the uncharted corridor designation, applied 3 centuries ago, updated periodically as new non-return cases accumulated, had conveyed most of that truth to the Igerin. The Igerin had looked at the notation and decided it was probably overstated. They had decided the council was being overcautious, that the corridor was dangerous in ordinary ways, that their fleet was sufficient. So the question I had to answer was, what notation, if any, would have conveyed the truth in a way that a capable, well-prepared, experienced commander could not have reasoned away? The more time I spent with this question, the more I came to believe the answer was none. Not because the truth was unstatable in principle, but because stating it required a vocabulary that the index did not contain, and that the index did not contain because the events that would have necessitated developing such a vocabulary had not, historically, produced survivors in sufficient numbers to report what they had seen. I could write, extreme capability adversary, all approaches result in total loss, non-return rate 100% across documented historical span. A careful reader would understand this was serious. A very careful reader might understand this was more serious than any other entry in the registers. But the compound notation, even at its most specific, was still making a statement about power, about a dangerous entity within a scale of dangerous entities, located at the extreme end of that scale. And what the relay data was describing was not located on that scale. The relay data described something that did not correspond to any point on the scale of powerful adversaries, because the scale had been built from encounters where the encountering parties had produced at least some evidence, and what happened in the corridor produced nothing. The 47 seconds, that was all there was. And the 47 seconds said, if you read it carefully, not that something enormously powerful had destroyed 14 ships, but that something had completed a task in 47 seconds and then stopped, and the task had been not effortful exactly. Brief. The word that kept occurring to me, sitting at the drafting table, was incidental, as though the task, from the perspective of whatever completed it, had been incidental. I erased the blank draft of the compound notation and looked at the empty margin for a while, and then I thought about Orvin Thale's other phrase, the one he used less often, the one that he only ever said once to each apprentice, on the day the apprentice's formal training ended. He had said it to me on the last day, before I took up the outer registers on my own, standing at the door of the hall in the early dark of the Orvithsan morning. He said, "There will be entries in the registers that you cannot resolve in your career, not for want of effort. The outer reaches contain some things that resist the available vocabulary. When you encounter one of those entries, do not force the vocabulary onto it. The forced notation is worse than the blank space, because the forced notation tells the reader the thing has been understood, and some things have not been understood and should not be presented as though they have." I had not thought about that particular statement in many years. I thought about it now. I made my decision that night. I was alone in the hall, and I sat at the drafting table for a while after I had decided, because I was not sure, even then, that I was right. I had been taught all my career that the blank space is the cartographer's failure, that refusing to mark something is a betrayal of the reader, who deserves the truth, and who has a right to expect that the person who maintained the registers had the courage to write the difficult truth rather than the comfortable nothing. I want to be honest about how long that sitting took, because I think it matters. It was not an hour. It was not an evening. I came to the hall the following morning and sat again, and I left in the afternoon having made no progress, and I came back the third morning and sat again. 3 days of returning to the blank draft and the relay logs, and the problem of what the honest thing to do was. My colleagues noticed. They did not ask. Surveyors learn early not to press a colleague who is working something out. But I could feel their attention in the way that the hall went quiet around my workstation, the way that the ordinary sound of instruments and consultation seemed to give my corner of the room a wider berth than usual. On the third day, I understood what I had been doing in those long sessions that had not, until then, felt like productive work. I had been grieving, in the dry methodical way that cartographers grieve, for the notation that did not exist, for the symbol that someone should have invented but had never needed to invent, because nothing in the prior history of the outer reaches had made its invention necessary. I had been grieving for the limit of the index, which was also the limit of everything that had happened up to this point that was comprehensible enough to be recorded. And on the third day, I understood that grief was the right response, and that what came after grief in this case was not a better notation. What came after grief was the blank. I believed this, I still believe it. What I had come to understand, sitting in the hall with the relay data on the secondary table, was that the blank space and the honest space are not always different things. That there are some truths for which the honest mark is the absence of a mark, because a mark implies that the thing being marked has been understood to the degree that a symbol can represent it, and some things have not been understood to that degree, and to mark them anyway is to present a comprehension that does not exist. The compound notation would have told the reader, there is a very dangerous civilization here. Proceed with extreme caution or not at all. That statement is true as far as it goes. The problem is that it is true in the register of ordinary extreme danger, and what lives in the blank sector is not located in that register. A reader, a careful, experienced, well-prepared reader, the kind of reader that the registers are built for, would look at the compound notation and understand that the risk was very high. They might even understand that the risk was at the extreme high end of all documented risks. But they would still be reading a statement about a powerful adversary, and powerful adversaries can be assessed, can be prepared for, can occasionally be negotiated with or avoided by route adjustment or, in extremis, matched by sufficient force. The blank space says, this region is not mapped. And yes, a hasty reader might take from that only that the region had not yet been surveyed, that the blankness was an absence of data rather than a considered act. For that reader, the blank would fail to convey what I intended. But the outer registers exist in a context, and anyone who had consulted them with the attention they deserve would know that the registers do not leave sectors blank out of neglect. The Hall's record for survey coverage in the outer reaches is meticulous. The blank space is anomalous in a catalog that prides itself on having no anomalies, and a careful reader, noticing the anomaly, would understand that its existence was not an accident. A careful reader would stop. And the reader the chart is not for, the reader who would look at the blank and think only that here is a region awaiting survey. That reader would also stop. Because crossing into an unsurveyed region is something even inexperienced navigators are trained to approach with caution, and the caution appropriate to an unsurveyed sector is, functionally, a more useful frame than the caution appropriate to a known dangerous adversary. An unsurveyed region carries the implicit message, we do not know what is here. That message keeps the cautious cautious and gives the incautious pause in a way that even an extreme hazard designation, by its very specificity, sometimes fails to do. I drew the boundary line of the blank sector that night. It was the longest line I have ever drawn, not in physical length. The line on the chart is perhaps 40 centimeters at the scale of the registers, but in weight. I drew it with more attention to the quality of the line than I usually give, because it seemed to me that the line deserved the attention. It was not marking a territory. It was not bounding a known hazard or delineating a survey region. It was marking the edge of what the chart could speak to. It was saying, here is where the outer registers end. What is beyond this line is not charted. Not because it has not been examined, but because examination has not produced data that the chart can honestly convey. Beyond this line, the chart says nothing. That is the mark. That is what it means. I removed the provisional designation that had been assigned to the corridor 3 centuries ago. I removed the survey date. I removed the historical annotation noting when the corridor had first been flagged and by whom. I removed all the accumulated addenda. I left nothing in the space except blankness, bounded by the line I had drawn, and I made the line solid, not the dotted provisional boundary used for unsurveyed regions where survey was anticipated, but a solid line, final and complete, the same weight as the lines that bound established systems and mapped transit lanes. This was a significant deviation from Register's protocol. Removing existing designations requires senior surveyor authorization. I was at that time still the 4th surveyor. I acted without authorization, and I submitted my decision in writing to the senior counsel of the Hall the following morning, with the full relay data appended and a complete explanation of my reasoning. I said that I was prepared to accept whatever professional consequences followed. The senior counsel reviewed my decision for 9 days. They pulled the relay data and looked at it themselves. They consulted, I was told later, with 2 council member species who had their own long institutional memories of the corridor, though neither had lost ships there in recent centuries, and both had maintained their own versions of a non-approach designation for generations. After 9 days, the senior counsel issued a formal endorsement of the revised chart. The blank sector was made official. The deletion of the provisional corridor designation was approved and carried through the full distribution chain of the registers. On the morning the endorsement came through, the senior surveyor at that time, an elder Veth named Karoth Vim, who had worked the registers for longer than I had been alive and who was, by general agreement among everyone who had ever served under him, the most demanding and least effusive person in the hall, came to my workstation and stood at the edge of the drafting table and looked at the chart for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, that the work was good. That was the only time in my career that Karothvim ever said those words to me. He was not a person who gave compliments lightly, or at all. I understood that the comment was not, specifically, a compliment for my draftsmanship. I want to tell you one more thing before I close this account, because it bears on the question that people always ask when they learn about the blank sector. The question of what, exactly, is inside it. What the 47 seconds represents. What humanity, as the outer reaches have come to think of the inhabitants of that region, actually is. I cannot answer that question precisely, and I want to be honest about why. The honest answer is that 3 centuries of non-return and 47 seconds of relay data, and the total absence of any communication, diplomatic or otherwise, from the inhabitants of the blank sector across the entirety of recorded galactic history, these things do not add up to a picture of humanity. They add up to a record of what contact with humanity's space produces in the entities that attempt it, which is different. The record is silence, absence. A light briefly, and then the instruments return to normal range, and then nothing. What the inhabitants of the blank sector are in themselves, their civilization, their history, the nature of their thought and their intention and their relationship to the galaxy around them, I do not know. No one I have spoken with knows. The Council has records that predate the current blank sector designation by centuries, accumulated during a period when the approach to the corridor was not yet formalized as forbidden, and those records are fragmentary and contradictory, and in several cases clearly the product of conflation between actual observations and the kind of mythologized elaboration that grows around anything that is feared and not understood. I have read all of them. I have come away from the reading with no cleaner picture than I had before. What I do know, what the outer registers record in their honest way, is that the blank sector has been blank for the full span of the register's modern operation, and that in that time, the number of civilizations that have ignored the blank and sent ships into it and received any of those ships back is 0. Not small, not nearly 0, 0. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. The outer reaches are full of dangerous regions, many of which have earned their designations through catastrophic encounters, and in every other case documented in the register's hazard history, in all 14 of the confirmed extinction-level events, in all the lesser catastrophes, in all the recorded cases of ships meeting things in the dark that they were not prepared for, some ships came back. Not enough ships, not the right ships, but some. Some evidence, some debris, some transmission. Some record of what happened, however incomplete. From the blank sector, nothing. Across 3 centuries, from every civilization that made the attempt, and the Igeran are not the only ones, merely the most recent and the most documented, nothing. I thought about this often in the years after I drew the boundary line. I thought about what it means for a civilization to be so completely outside the register of outcomes that the standard notation of extreme hazard, which has room for civilizations that destroy all incoming ships, for regions that are simply and absolutely fatal, still does not capture it accurately. The standard hazard notation is built around the assumption that the hazard is a property of the region that exists regardless of approach, and that the approaching party changes nothing about the hazard except the likelihood of encountering it. What the blank sector records is different. The silence is not the silence of a danger waiting in the dark for something to come within its reach. It is the silence of an outcome so complete and so unhesitating that it generates nothing, no debris, no signal, no residue. Just the 47 seconds, and then the instrument settling back to baseline, and then the long quiet. I have heard many theories about what humanity is. Most of them attempt to place the blank sector's inhabitants within a familiar category, a very powerful civilization, a very old civilization, a civilization with technology sufficiently advanced to be indistinguishable from natural forces. These theories are not wrong in the way that false statements are wrong. They are wrong in the way that the compound notation was wrong. They are accurate as far as they go, and they do not go far enough. They use the vocabulary of the scale, and what is in the blank sector is not located on the scale. The theory I have found most useful over the years is not a theory about what humanity is. It is a theory about what the blank sector means. The blank sector means that there is a region of space whose inhabitants have arrived, through whatever history and whatever process, at a relationship with the rest of the galaxy that the rest of the galaxy's conventions, of notation, of diplomacy, of hazard assessment, of the ordinary procedures by which civilizations interact with things they fear, were not built to describe. Not more powerful in the way that a larger fleet is more powerful than a smaller one. Not more advanced in the way that an older technology is more advanced than a newer one. Simply outside the frame of what the frame was designed to hold. When something is outside the frame, the honest cartographer's response is the blank. Not because there is nothing there, because the mark that could accurately describe what is there has not yet been invented, and to use an inadequate mark is to do a disservice to both the thing being marked and the reader who will, someday, need to make a decision in the dark. I am nearly finished. There is one last thing I want to record, because it was the moment at which I understood, fully and without remainder, that I had been right to draw the blank. It was about 6 months after the senior council endorsed the revised chart. A delegation from one of the council's younger member species, the Veth, who had recently achieved reliable jump capability and were in the early stages of their first serious survey of the outer reaches, came to the hall on Veth for what their lead surveyor described as a consultation about the registers. They had been studying the charts as part of their survey preparation, and they had questions. The lead surveyor was young, by Veth standards, very capable. I could tell that within the first few minutes of our conversation. They had read the registers with obvious care. They asked good questions about the hazard notation system, about the protocol for flagging newly discovered risks in regions adjacent to existing designations, about the conventions for provisional markers in areas where a survey team had observed but not yet fully mapped. They were thorough, systematic, and clearly serious about their work. And then they asked about the blank sector. They had noticed, of course they were careful readers, that the blank sector was anomalous. No designation, no survey date, none of the standard provisional markings that every other unmapped region in the registers carried. A boundary line that was solid rather than dotted, final rather than provisional. It stood out in the chart the way a gap in a complete record stands out, obviously, immediately, as something that requires explanation. They asked whether the blank space indicated a region that was already surveyed, but not yet recorded in the distributed copies, whether there was a supplementary archive they had not yet been directed to. I told them there was not. They asked what the blank space indicated, if not a gap in the survey record. I told them that the blank space indicated a region about which the outer registers had nothing to say. They were quiet for a moment. The Veth have bioluminescent skin patterning that shifts with their emotional state in ways they cannot fully control. It makes conversations with them an interesting supplement to what they are actually saying. The lead surveyor's patterning shifted, at that moment, towards something I read as the visual equivalent of a held breath. They asked carefully, measuring their words, whether the blank space bordered the region that older council species sometimes referred to as the corridor. I said that it encompassed the corridor and extended somewhat beyond the corridor's formerly charted boundaries, because the relay data had indicated that the formally charted boundaries had been conservative estimates of the relevant zone's extent, and I had drawn the new boundary to reflect a more defensible margin. They said nothing for a while. Their patterning had gone still, not dark, but quiet, which in Veth means something close to what careful attention means in Veth. Then they asked, "Is there a recommended approach distance?" I told them that the recommended approach distance was the boundary line I had drawn, which was clearly marked on the chart, and that I would characterize the recommendation as a final boundary rather than a cautionary guideline. They asked, "Is there any council provision for exceptions? Any diplomatic protocol that a member species might invoke to request closer approach authorization for scientific purposes?" I said, "The blank space carries no authorization protocol because the blank space carries no designation, and without a designation, there is no administrative framework within which an authorization could be issued or processed." I watched the patterning while I said this. It shifted again, something slower, something that felt, in the way that you learn to read a very different kind of face over many years of working with a variety of species, like the recognition of a message that is not being spoken in words. The lead surveyor was understanding something. Not just hearing it, understanding it. The blank space carries no designation. Not because the space was not important enough to designate, because the designation had been deliberately withheld, because the people who maintained the registers, who had an index built to describe any hazard they had ever encountered, had looked at this region and decided that the honest thing was not to describe it. A careful reader, hearing that, would not conclude that the region was simply uninteresting. They would conclude that the region was beyond the vocabulary of description. And they would know that the Veth cartographers, who had been building and maintaining the most comprehensive hazard record in the outer reaches for 3 centuries, had a very large vocabulary. The lead surveyor of the Veth delegation sat with this for a long time. Then they thanked me for the consultation, gathered their materials carefully, and left. Their patterning, as they left, was very still. They did not return to ask further questions about the blank sector. The Veth survey, as far as I have been able to follow it through the update submissions that reach the hall, has proceeded with genuine thoroughness in every direction from their home systems. They have found hazards that were not previously recorded and have notated them well, within the hall's standards. They have not submitted any survey data from the direction of the blank sector, not approach data, not distant observation data, not even corridor adjacency survey data of the kind that their coverage of surrounding regions would have naturally included if they were surveying comprehensively. That region of the outer reaches, in the Veth surveys, does not appear. They left their own blank space, adjacent to mine. I considered briefly whether to add a notation to the hall's copy of the Veth submissions indicating this absence, whether to mark the gap in their coverage, a small annotation, a note in the margin indicating that the omission was deliberate, that the lead surveyor had consulted the outer registers and made an informed choice. I decided against it. The absence is its own notation. Anyone who reads the Veth surveys with the same care the lead surveyor brought to the outer registers will notice the gap and understand what it means. That is the system working correctly, not the symbols, not the index assembled across centuries of careful hazard documentation. The blank, the gap that speaks, the deliberate silence of people who looked at the evidence and understood that the only mark adequate to the truth was no mark at all. I have said what I came to say. I am writing this for the hall's internal record and for my apprentice, who will in time be the one responsible for the blank sector's continued maintenance, a task that is not, in practical terms, demanding. The sector requires no updates. No survey data comes in from that direction. The boundary line does not shift. The blank space remains blank. What I want my apprentice to understand, and what I want anyone who reads this account to understand, is that the blank space is not a failure. It is not a gap. It is not the absence of work. It is the most considered mark I have made in 60 years of working the outer registers. It is the chart being honest about the limit of what the chart can say. If you are a surveyor and you work in the outer reaches long enough, there may come a moment, perhaps once in a career, perhaps never, when you encounter something that the index does not hold, When the available symbols, assembled in every combination the protocol permits, still do not say the true thing. When the honest mark is the blank. I hope you will have the patience to recognize that moment, and the clarity to act on the recognition without reaching for the comfort of an inadequate notation. And if you do, the steadiness to sit with the decision long enough to be sure it is right before you draw the line. The line once drawn is drawn. That is all. I do not speak further of what lies beyond it.